Handout. Yep, good. Good morning. One note as you get ready to start here, the packet that you picked up with the handout that actually covers all 5 weeks of this Bible study. So it'd be great if you can bring them back from week to week. But if not, we will have some extras made as well. The Reverend Dr. Michael Berg is an assistant professor of theology at Wisconsin Lutheran College, where he teaches apologetics, Christian worship, life and thought of Martin Luther, Christ in the Old Testament, and Christ and culture. He is married to Amanda, and together they have 3 daughters. Before moving to Milwaukee, the Bergs lived in Wood Lake, Minnesota, where Michael served as pastor of St. John's Lutheran Church, and Amanda as the director of St. John's Lutheran Preschool. Dr. Berg is a graduate of Martin Luther College, Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary, the International Academy of Apologetics, Human Rights, and Evangelism, and Biola University. He is the author of at least 4 books: Vocation, The Setting for Human Flourishing, The Baptismal Life, On Any Given Sunday, and an upcoming book on the theology of the cross. He also co-hosts the podcast Let the Bird Fly. We're excited and grateful to have him here to guide us in being theologians of the cross. Dr. Berg.
Thank you. All right. All right, I think I'm on. Can we hear? Yes? Okay. No? How about now? I'm on. 1, 2, 3, there we go. All right. Thanks for having me back. I appreciate it. I think it's been a couple years since I was here. And I've been asked to talk about the theology of the cross. And this comes from a set of theses that Martin Luther wrote in 1518. Now, you've all heard of the 95 Theses, yes? Yeah? Boring. Don't even bother with them. All right. They're historically important, but there's a lot of them, right? And some of them are good and some of them are okay. More importantly, he was asked to defend a set of theses before his fellow Augustinian friars. And so this would be kind of like a professor or a pastor at a pastor's conference setting forth before other theologians what he was thinking about, right? And so they're a little bit more precise. They're a little bit later, not much later, but a little bit later. And so he's thought some things through, and they're brilliant. And I wish that we could get rid of the 95 Theses in your mind and replace them with the Heidelberg Theses. All right, that was boring. We'll maybe get back to that history and stuff at the end. If you notice, we have 6 lessons here, even though we only have 5 Sundays. We'll probably go faster and get through all of them, but the last lesson is basically the theses that I'm going to reference and with a little bit of commentary on them. So it may be something that you can just take home. All right. So before we get into this definition of what the theology of the cross is, let's talk about a guy named St. Peter. You know St. Peter very well, don't you? And St. Peter kind of gets a bad rap, or he gets too much credit. He's like the quarterback on the NFL team, right? Too much credit or too much blame, right? And so in the Roman Catholic Church and in other denominations, Peter is put on a pedestal, right? He is a leader. He is a man of faith. He's bold, all that kind of thing. But I don't know about you, but I have preached and you have heard many sermons where Peter gets dumped on a lot, right? And that's also rightfully so. So when I think about St. Peter, though, and his life as recorded to us in the Gospels and then in Acts, and then his reflection as an old man, sort of an old man. I pictured him that way. An old man in his letters, his general letters. It seems to me that there are two phases in Peter's life. It's not that easy, but when I read about Peter in the Gospels, and I read about Peter in Acts, it's almost like they're two completely different people, right? So give me a description. Let's get some participation. Give me a description of Peter in the Gospels. What do you know about him? Someone want to give me a characteristic, a description of Peter in the Gospels? He's always doing what? He's always talking, right? He just won't shut up, right? He's always talking, and he shoots off his mouth. And when he's always talking, he's very often making promises. He makes promises to God. You ever done that? You make a promise to God? Here's what I think about your promises to God. They stink. Quit making promises to God. It's the other way around. It's the other way around. Why are you bothering making promises to God? It's kind of like when your young children make promises to you. Or in my context, when college or high school students make promises to me. Like, I'm gonna get that assignment in. I'm gonna really try. I'm gonna get it done next week. And I go, okay, that's adorable. When your young children promise, like, I am going to clean my room every day, and I'm going to do my homework without you ragging on me. I'm going to do that. And it's usually because there's something that they want, right? Then you'll buy me something or whatever. And you know full well that this promise is not going to be fulfilled. You're not an idiot, right? This is Peter constantly making promises to God when he should just be quiet and listen to the promises that God has made to him, right? Peter is at the same time extremely bold in the Gospels, right? So he's always talking, but I mean he's out there. He does not coward very often in the Gospels. He's there. He is bold. He's making promises to God. He's willing to put himself out there, while many of the other apostles seem to be like, oh, just hold on, I'm not quite sure. Peter's like, nope, you are Christ. Right? When Jesus says, who do people say I am? And then, who do you say I am? You are Christ. Right? Okay. So Peter's constantly putting himself into these positions where he often fails, and we rightfully call him out on that, right? And so many a sermon on Peter being kind of a fool. But then when you read about him in Acts, it's almost as if his personality is completely different. He is very passive. Now he's actually a leader. I wonder if that's part of it. He's actually a leader that has to deal with real problems. You know, like the candidate on the trail is, oh man, he's got lots of promises. She's really bold, right? And then all of a sudden they get to the governor's office, and then on the desk is all of the real problems in the world that need to be solved, right? I think it's a humbling kind. Maybe that's part of it. But notice that he is actually passive in his leadership as well. Getting ahead of myself, but remember, one of the main controversies of the very early church was, what do you do with Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians? How are we going to meld these groups together that had been so foreign to each other? And even not just by customs, but by the law of God. There was barriers between them. And one of the big questions was, well, how much of the Old Testament customs do we need to follow in this new kingdom? Do we need to circumcise our boys? Do we need to not eat shellfish and pork and all of those things? And we look back at that and say, what's the big deal? But that was a really big deal there, because that was a lot of to do with their identity, right? And they did want to do what was right according to the law of God. And it was a kind of a difficult thing. And Peter kind of sort of plays both sides. He knows that these laws really were for a purpose to set Israel apart, to bring about the Messiah. And once the Messiah comes, you don't need to do them anymore, right? Because the Jewish Messiah gets to be the Messiah for everybody, yeah? And you certainly don't need to do the sacrifices anymore because Jesus is the sacrifice, right? And so he knows that theologically, but he also knows that it's very difficult for somebody to pull themselves out of a culture, right? Like if you never ate pork or shellfish and it was hammered into you that this was terrible and awful, you don't go to the post-Pentecost first potluck and eat the bacon-wrapped weenies. You're going to throw up, right? This would be like us forcing some sort of food from a different culture on you and say, deal with it. You wouldn't even want to sit with those people because of the smell and stuff like that, right? And so the problem, of course, is when Jewish Christians would say to the Gentile Christians, hey, in order to be saved, you can't eat shellfish, right? Opposing those man-made customs onto these new people. And Peter kind of plays both sides until who comes and shames him a little bit and scolds him? Paul does, right? So think about then Peter in the Gospels. Boom. And then think about Peter in Acts. He's like, meh, okay, I agree with you, right? Something happened. Something happened in my mind between the Peter of the Gospels and the Peter we find in Acts. I wonder if it's Maundy Thursday. Now, it's never one event, right? Paul was converted on the road to Damascus. That was kind of a one-time event thing, but there was some preparation that led up to that, and there was some preaching from Ananias and baptism and then Jesus after that. We really like to pinpoint that one thing for conversion, that kind of thing, and that's fine, but we also understand that there's a part of a process that's going on here. So there's a process that is going on that changes Peter, but it comes to a head, I believe, on Maundy Thursday night. And so if we would say there's two stages in Peter's life, I would argue there's the pre-Maundy Thursday Peter and the post-Maundy Thursday Peter. What happens on Maundy Thursday for Peter? After the Lord's Supper is instituted, and they go out and they pray in the Garden of Gethsemane, what happens? What's that? Okay, they fall asleep, and then when they wake up, back in there, yeah? He denies Jesus, not just once, but 3 times, right? And I think you see the best/worst of Peter that night, and then you see him being absolutely humiliated. I mean best and worst because he was bold, but it was the worst because he was bold in the wrong way. How was he bold on Maundy Thursday night?
Cut off the ear of the serpent.
He backed up his words, right? I mean, he was willing to put himself into danger, something that he had promised, right? Remember, he promises to Jesus all the time, everybody else will deny you. These fools, he's like to the 11, he's like, I'll be there. And he does it. Now, he's a big man on campus with a sword in his hand. A little bit later, there's a servant girl who says, don't you know him? And he cowers in fear. Right? There's a whole lesson there. Right? So we see Peter, who is at his boldest and his best. He's a hero, defending his guy, Jesus, fighting against the injustice of this illegal and unjust arrest. He's a hero in a movie. He's a hero there. And yet, that is his fatal flaw. What is Peter getting, what is Peter trying to stop that evening?
Jesus' crucifixion.
Yeah. Just think about how that plays out if Jesus does not die on the cross. Okay? So Peter, in his exuberance and his pride and his courage and all of the good words that we give to each other, is actually fighting against the salvation of the world, and he doesn't know it. And here is where we get this idea of the theology of the cross versus the theology of glory. So, by the way, when we talk about being a theologian of the cross, there's always the opposite side, and that's being a theologian of glory. Okay. Now, one of the things about the theology of the cross is that you see everything through the lens of the cross. So I look at my life with these glasses on, yeah? And they're cross-colored glasses. And so I see everything through the lens of the cross. And when I see through the lens of the cross, I see something different than when I have my other glasses on. My other glasses are glory glasses. These are the glasses that you were born with and that the world puts on you and the world wants you to wear and how you normally look at the world. Yeah? When I look through the lens of glory, I use my reason. I take in empirical evidence. Empirical just means what I can see, hear, touch, taste, and smell. Through my senses, I get information, and then in my brain, I make decisions and conclusions. This is really good in life. This will get you home today. Yep, because you'll stop at the red light, right? This will feed you today. This will make sure you get a paycheck next week. This is good stuff. But when it comes to understanding ourselves and God and the world as it really is, especially the spiritual realm, the glory glasses aren't very good. The cross glasses is how you should look at the world. So, Peter's got glory glasses on when he sees the soldiers dispatched by the high priest coming after Jesus. This is bad. I better do something. Yeah? By the way, Peter does this throughout the Gospels. Remember the Mount of Transfiguration? We'll get to that later, but remember the Mount of Transfiguration? And Jesus is there, Moses and Elijah is there, shining in glory. And what does Peter want to do? Set up 3 tents, and it's a beautiful picture because the tabernacle and the tenting of God. Let me set up 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He wants to bottle up the heavenly glory. This would be good for the cause. His theology of glory mind is rationalizing, right? Because if everybody sees the glory of God, then of course they would follow you, Jesus. And Jesus is like, did you not read the Old Testament? Remember Pharaoh? Yeah. Remember all of your ancestors? Right? That's not how it works. You don't really go by sight, you go by hearing. We'll talk about that connection a little bit later. Okay. But if Peter on Maundy, Thursday saw through the lenses of the cross, he would see that this arrest, as illegal and as unjust as it was, and how awful the crucifixion was going to be, he would be able to see the true glory of God, and that is his love for sinners, right? There's kind of a curious thing Jesus often, he kind of hints at, sometimes outright says, when he says, the Son of Man has to be handed over into the hands of men and suffer many things and die. And he said, and he connects that to the true glory of God. Let's go down a sidebar for a little bit. Don't worry, I'll come back. Maybe. You've probably been told that the crucifixion is akin to like the electric chair or something like that. And it's a fine analogy where you're like, hey, we wear on our necks and put on our walls this picture of an execution. Would be like doing that with an electric chair. Okay, I get the point. However, there really is no modern equivalent to the crucifixion. There just isn't. Go through all the modern, and I mean modern as in the last 500 years, modern forms of execution. Firing squad, guillotine, hanging, electric chair, maybe there's some others, I don't know. Those are all humane compared to crucifixion. They're fairly quick and easy. They may be done publicly to send a message, but still nothing like the crucifixion. The crucifixion was meant to make somebody look subhuman, to make them so cursed and so deformed and so ugly that nobody would follow them as, this is a martyr. It was propaganda in the in the ancient world. You never wasted a death. You always wanted it. It's very mob-like. You got to send a message. And so we're going to crucify him on a road up to Jerusalem so everybody sees. We're going to torture him. Most likely, when they whipped him, there would have been shards of stone embedded in the leather, so that the skin would have been ripped off of his back. And they thought this through, because if you're going to put somebody on a piece of wood that I'm pretty sure wasn't milled and sanded and primed, but was very rough with splinters, you're going to be moving and hold yourself up, and so all of the nerves would be exposed. We have nothing like it in our world, right? This idea of the curse of the cross. So for a person at this time to even contemplate, even theoretically, that the cross could somehow be good was beyond absurd. Beyond absurd. There is no way anybody could put those things together. So for Christ to subtly keep saying, but I have to die, but I got to be crucified, this is to the glory of God, it would have been something that I think would not have computed with them, and they just would have ignored it as something mysterious and bizarre. Right? And so it's not so easy to take the glory glasses off and put on the cross glasses. And so here comes, I think, the kicker. Jesus needs to work on Peter and knock those glasses off his face. And it's going to come through deep humiliation and pain and suffering. Yeah? So let's stop for a minute and think about your life right now. You are born with glory glasses. It's your default position, and you like them. You like them because it seems like there's a happy ending. You like them because you're in control, because you can rationalize things. You like them because it's compact and right in front of you. It's not mysterious and beyond you. We do this in the church all the time. We say, okay, here's the problem and here is the solution. And the solutions come down to just maybe a few things. If we had the right leadership, if we had the right music/worship, if we had the right budget, right? Those are basically the three things that we think will solve all of our problems, right? That's a theology of glory way of thinking, right? It's very reasonable and necessary in some cases. But notice that we don't really solve the problem, which is our utter sinfulness and our depravity and our rebellion against God. Yeah? We think that we're redeemable in and of ourselves. Yeah? So if I just prayed a little bit more, if I made my way through the Bible in 1 year, if my kid would just go to church every Sunday, all of these things, then everything would just be smooth and easy and it would be fantastic. Yeah? The assumption is that you have a free will and that you can make decisions on your own when it comes to sin and grace. The assumption is that there's a kernel of goodness in you that just needs to be activated a little bit. The assumption is that you're bad and you're good, and the good can overcome the bad. But that the truth of the matter is, and we see this throughout Jesus' words, even though they're a little subtle, and we see them throughout Paul's words, not so subtle, is that you need to die. Your sinful nature needs to be crucified, and you need to die. There is no reforming the sinner. The sinner is just the sinner. And if you reform the sinner, all you have is a reformed sinner. That guy's got to die. And what needs to be resurrected is a new person. Resurrected, a new person, and that is Christ living in you. And that's a radical, different way of looking at the world. So, how are we going to get Peter from pre-Maundy, Thursday Peter to post-Maundy, Thursday Peter? God's going to work on him, and it's going to be painful, just like God's working on you, and sometimes it's painful. Yeah. And if you are seeing your pain and your suffering through the lenses of glory, you're going to fall apart. Because you'll rationalize, well, bad things have happened, therefore God doesn't love me, or God doesn't exist, or God doesn't care about me, or something else. Or I haven't been good enough, or whatever. Or I need to try harder. All law answers. But if you look through the lens of the cross, you see the most ugly, unjust curse of a death, crucifixion, and still have the guts to call it a Good Friday. That means that the cross that is in front of you right now, and by the way, you don't choose crosses, they're laid before you. The cross that is laid before you right now, maybe it's cancer. Maybe it is a broken relationship. Maybe it's bankruptcy. Maybe it is, you name, I don't know what's going on in your life, but you're thinking about it right now. That cross is still a Good Friday. And the only way you know that is by faith. Because you can't reason yourself there. Oh, we'll try. We'll say silly things, like every cloud has a silver lining. And when God shuts a door, he opens a window. You don't know what God's doing with the doors and the windows. I think last time I was here, the only story about doors and windows is when Thomas was, and the disciples were hiding in those first days after the resurrection, and God made sure all the doors and the windows were closed. So Thomas had nowhere to go but to him. He couldn't escape. Right? So this is, I think, a game changer, because we now ironically have a theology of suffering. We can't answer all the reasons why suffering is sent into our world, but we have a theology of suffering, and our world right now does not have one, and hasn't had one since the medieval period. Another tangent. In the modern period, and what I mean by the modern period is like after the Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, up into the computer age, and it was very optimistic. Yep. I believe that we're transitioning to a different period now. We are not as optimistic. In the past, we were so optimistic about humanity that we thought we could figure everything out. We even had people who literally believed that they could overcome death. Ted Williams' head is in a freezer somewhere, right, waiting for a cure of whatever he died for. We were okay with the collateral damage of progress, environmentally, socially, that kind of stuff. Not anymore, right? And so we're at a transition period. But the modern period was very optimistic about humanity. In fact, we didn't really need God. Oh, we'll still believe in him. He's kind of up there, though, like a deist God who doesn't come down here. Or he's the God we pray to. He's like the sleepy grandfather, right? You wake him up and he like gives you a hard candy out of his pocket or something like that, you know? Or this, God's got a plan for me and my job is to try to figure out what the plan is. But everything was going to be okay and everything was going to get better. And property values were always going to go up and we were going to solve all of the problems of the world and stuff like that. Then we got to the 20th century and we just killed each other on massive levels. Now I'm happy for all the advancements that I take advantage of and take for granted, like indoor plumbing and modern medicine, stuff like that. But there's always ramifications to all of those things, right? Like the opioid crisis, right? And so in the modern period, because they had this such faith in humanity and this optimism, that the idea of suffering and spiritual struggle was not something we talked about even in the church. And so the idea was there that we could overcome all of pain and suffering with what I call the three pills: a policy, a psychology, or the three Ps: a psychology, a policy, or a pill. Right? And if we just did those things right, we could end all sadness and pain. And we wake up in the late 20th and early 21st century with a loneliness epidemic and drug abuse and corruption and all the rest. It didn't work. Turns out we couldn't fix our problem, right? So this, as one person called this, pathological optimism, yeah, leads to a problem because we don't have a theology of suffering anymore. I began this class saying all of you have heard about the 95 Theses, but very few of you, I'm willing to bet, had heard about the Heidelberg Disputation and the theses that came from that. Part of it is just because the 95 Theses is historically important and it's a part of the story and yada, yada, yada. But I wonder also if the Heidelberg Disputation has some tough things to say, and we have to confront suffering and pain and the question of why God allows and even sends pain and suffering into our life. And that just didn't fit our modern optimism. It just didn't fit our modern optimism. So I would suggest that you and I, who are heirs of the Reformation, that we have something very unique to offer the world right now, and that is a theology of suffering, a meaning for suffering. Not necessarily an explanation of why things happen, but a deep meaning of suffering. 51% of life is suffering, and that's on a good day when you're 18 years old in America, let alone a bad day if you're 72 with cancer in Sierra Leone. And so if life is going to have meaning, suffering has to have meaning. We have to deal with this. Because otherwise, if pain is just meaningless, it just happens and there's no solution, and what are you going to do? Well, this is a recipe for depression at best and suicide at worst. And not only the suicide of an individual who is struggling, but the suicide of entire cultures, right? Because you've pinned all of your hope on a government, a political party, a politician, a school, or whatever. Yeah? And when those fail, what's left? What's left, right? So, glory versus cross, really, really important. All right. That was a bit of a downer, and it was meant to be. But there is hope. There is hope even in suffering. And I think that at the end of this class, hopefully, you'll get that. Okay, I'm going to take a breather just for a second and see if anybody wants to make a comment or make a question. The rest of this period, I have some preliminary things that we'll get to, and eventually we'll get into a little bit more of the two lenses and the two stories and the hiddenness of God and the meaning of suffering. But you have to come back next week for that. All right, anybody like to add some 2 cents? I will take that as I'm a brilliant professor. and not a boring one. That was a glory thing to say, wasn't it? Isaac.
So, the theology of the cross is similar, at least in concept, to the Platonic cave?
No, because let me just explain that a little bit. The Platonic cave idea comes from Plato, and that is we are living in a shadow world. So imagine a cave, and there's light coming in to the cave, and we're on this wall, chained up against the wall. And there's shadows that are dancing around on that wall over there because there's other people doing this. And Plato's idea there was the shadows, and that's all you know because you've been imprisoned in this wall. That's only the truth you know, but there is a true ideal outside of the world, right? And so the idea there is that there's true ideals like what a man is and what a woman is. And everything that we're in, this is just a shadow of a true table. Yeah? And I'm just a shadow of the true man. Now I know what you're after here is that we are blinded by that, and there's truth out there, and there's hiddenness and kind of stuff like that. But I would fight back against that and say, but I live in the real world, and it was a real crucifixion, and I'm a real human being, and it's a real suffering. So I get what you're saying, but probably two different things. Yes, in the back.
What would the theology of the cross have looked like in the life of an Old Testament believer?
Okay, theology of the cross in an Old Testament believer. All right, let me maybe try to think of an example that would be better, would be good. Let's take Abraham and Sarah. Yeah. So Abraham and Sarah are promised a child, and that from that child would come this great people, great land, and the Messiah. We know the story. The problem is God's promise was long in coming, and so Sarah is getting old, and I'm not talking just, all right, this, I'm in my 40s. This is post-menopause by decades. Yep. This ain't happening, right? This ain't happening. And so she then comes up with a plan, and she says, I know how babies are made. And God's plan ain't working, and so I'm going to give my maidservant to Abraham, and somehow this child then is going to carry on the family estate, the line of the Savior, all that kind of stuff. So she sees through the lenses of glory and says, this ain't working, my body is dead. That's how probably she would have thought about that. And so we need to do something. And so the only reasonable thing to do is to have a child by a different means. And so she thinks, I can end my suffering. And by the way, back then, for a woman not to have a child would have been seen as a curse. And there's something wrong with me. God hates me. It meant you probably, when your husband died, you didn't have power anymore because you didn't have you just didn't need a child, you needed a male child, right? Thankfully, we're out sort of that time period, right? So I can end my suffering by doing this work, by doing this work, by bringing out a child in the human way. And so Hagar's giving birth to Ishmael becomes a picture for St. Paul of the works of the law that human beings try to do, and becomes a child of human devising, but also a child burdened by the law, because you're still in the realm of your own human plans and it's not going to end well. And I think this is what's also fascinating about this is that Sarah's reason ain't very good, right? Like, our reason's not very good. Like, what did she think was going to happen? She thought that she would have this, Abraham would sleep with another woman and that would be okay? That there wouldn't be any kind of, I don't know, friction between them two? And friction between the two children? It's not her child. It's not her child. She can steal the child, right? And so her reason ends up, you know, even though she thinks this is going to work, falters. God's plan is going to be, it's just not, you have to go by faith there. And so Isaac is the son of the promise, quite literally. Then this gets played out in the sacrifice of, almost sacrifice of Isaac. And so Abraham finally says, this is bad. Like, my glory glasses say, don't kill somebody, don't kill your own offspring, don't kill the offspring that is the promised child that's going to save the world, right? Like, there's nothing reasonable about this, right? And it's awful, and yet he finally got to the point where he said, I just got to trust what God's going to do. And so he has the lenses of cross on now and says, even though this looks awful, I know that there will be something good that comes out of it. Side note, Abraham did reason, though. We hear this in Hebrews. What does he reason? So my point is, it's not reason is not bad. Reason is over here, turn off your brain, and faith over here. No. Reason's always there, and reason is good. Our reason that trumps God's word, like Sarah did, trumped the promise of God, bad. But Abraham's reasoning under the word of God, fantastically beautiful. In the book of Hebrews, what are we told Abraham reasoned?
God could bring Isaac back from the dead.
There would be a resurrection. He reasoned that there would be a resurrection, and so he was ready to plunge that knife into his son's heart. Right? That's cross versus glory. Other Old Testament examples, we'll get to Joseph, who finally says to his brothers, you intended that for evil, God intended it for good. And I think if we have time today, we'll get to Job, which would be an example as well. Is that a satisfactory enough answer? All right. Before we go any further, we need to talk about the two kinds of righteousness. All right. So, there's two kinds of righteousness. We can talk about it in different ways, but I'm going to try to simplify it and say there's a righteousness by law and a righteousness by faith. This comes in St. Paul's letters to the Romans. All right. I want you to think of two systems, two ways of thinking. One is by law and one is by faith. The righteousness by law system is akin to glory, the story of glory, the theology of glory. And it's really good for day-to-day life, and it goes like this. You follow the laws, and then good things tend to happen to you. If you don't follow the laws, bad things tend to happen to you. If you work hard, there's a better chance for you to be successful than if you're lazy. The idea here is that you are right, which is that's what righteousness means. You're right. You're right with God, you're right with yourself, you're right with the world by following laws. And if you follow the laws, you will be right. You will be righteous. This system is really good for going to school and having a job. But it's a terrible system for love. Yeah? Because this system is not a gift system, it's not a love system, it's a wage system. And so God is not loving Father, God is your boss. And he's kind of a tyrant of a boss, right? Because he says things like, be perfect. And if you're not, So God pays the proper wages to you. You're good, you get blessed. You're bad, you get cursed. It's how life works. This is the system of a righteousness by law. Paul says, well, this stinks because you can't keep the law. And it's not even close. But there is a righteousness apart from the law that is through faith. And he goes back to Habakkuk and says the righteous live by faith. He keeps going back to Abraham, who believed and it was credited to him as righteousness. Right? By the way, the story of Abraham is purposely about all of his foibles. Like, the guy is a grade A jerk. You didn't get this in Sunday school. But he is a cowardly jerk. Remember Sarah in Egypt? Look it up later. All right. But then he is credited as if he is righteous because of the stuff he did. No, remember, he was a jerk. But because of faith, through faith. So the second system, a righteousness by faith, is this. The righteousness of God is given to the sinner. And this really opens up quite a bit of the Psalms for you, because you hear in the Psalms, God, you are my righteousness. You're like, well, this is some kind of poetic whatever. No, I meant something. Literally, God is my rightness. He makes me righteous. Let's go through this again. I love doing this. Raise your hand if you believe that sinners go to heaven. Sinners go to heaven. You're all wrong. Sinners don't go to heaven. If sinners went to heaven, it wouldn't be heaven anymore. It would be Wauwatosa all over again. God makes you not a sinner. He makes you worthy of his table. He's not like, oh, shucks, you're a sinner. Come on in. No, he's like, you're a sinner. You can't come in, so I need to make you not a sinner. That's why he threw out the guy who didn't have wedding clothes in the parable. Like, Jesus is like also a grade A jerk. He's like, this parable of this guy, and we threw a wedding, and everybody came in, and the guy who didn't have the nice clothes out. You're like, what does that mean? He wasn't righteous. He didn't have the righteous robe of Christ, right? God makes you worthy. We should go on this forever, because this is the basis for human rights. Everybody's going around saying, I got human rights just because I got human rights. Where do they come from? Where does your value come from? Just you saying so? That doesn't mean anything. It has to come from outside of you. God made you valuable. God makes you righteous. So a righteousness by faith is I'm right with God because God actually gave me the righteousness. His perfect life replaces my imperfect life. By the way, this opens up Romans chapter 6 for you, because you all memorize that the wages of sin is death. Okay. But you don't, but that's, you got to read the whole chapter. Paul is saying this righteousness by law is a wage system. You get paid the proper wages. The righteousness by faith system is a gift system. It's a love system. I just give it to you. No strings attached. And so he says, the wages of sin. You want to play that game? You want to be in the righteousness by law system? Guess what? The wages of sin, which you all got, is death. But the gift, the righteousness by faith system, the gift is eternal life in Christ Jesus. He's building an argument there in the first chapters of Romans. Okay, so this has to be in the back of your mind to understand the theology of glory and theology of cross. I would suggest it probably has to be in the back of your mind as you look at yourself and every other person you've ever met. I think here's the key to looking at our world today. When I see somebody who wants to be righteous. And this is not me as a theologian. Many atheists, commentators will make this point. Everybody wants to be right. They want to be valued. They want to be righteous, even if they don't use those words. And every moment of every day in your life, you're trying to be righteous by law, even if you don't know it. Yeah? It's why you make sure that your husband or wife knows that you did the you cleaned the dirty dishes 4 times in a row. It's why you have people that cannot help but give you their resume or their grandchildren's resume all of the time. Yeah. It explains all of the internet, explains road rage. It explains why people from different parts of the country say we're the ones who suffer the most and we're more righteous and than you over there in that other town. On every side of every debate. Okay. The tragedy is twofold. A, you can't be righteous by law, and B, you don't have to be. Now think about the freedom. Think about the freedom of not having that burden of always trying to make yourself look good to others, and whether you admit it or not, to God. This is St. Paul, right? He is saying, here's the 2 kinds of righteousness, law and faith. You can't be righteous by law. Here's a gift by faith. That's freedom. Oh, and what are you going to do with your freedom now that you are righteous, made righteous? Well, you're going to start loving your neighbor now. And you're not going to see your neighbor as somebody that you used to be righteous, but you're actually going to love them, and it's going to be beautiful. Right? Okay. I'll stop right there. Anybody want any clarification on that? Yeah.
So when I ponder this, I kind of almost think of this whole topic as it's inherently countercultural, and I use Christmas as an example. The world comes up with Santa, and on Christmas Eve, non-believers go to bed hoping they don't get coal in the morning. Christmas Eve, we come to church and celebrate the birth of our Savior. And that's how I kind of square this whole thing, is everything that culture does is inherently through the lens of glory, and we just got to go counterculture.
And law, through the lens of law. And let that be a lesson to your preachers and teachers. That when you walk into this pew, walk into this building and sit down on the pew, you're coming with a week's worth of law, because that's the only thing the world's got. Not just the law placed upon you at work, culture, but the law you place upon yourselves. I'm not good unless I do this. I'm not worthy unless I do this. And your preachers need to release you from that prison every Sunday. And if they don't, they're not doing their job. Like the last place we need more law is the church. The law in the church is to just say, hey, just so you know, if there's just that little kernel left after your week that you think you're pretty darn good, I'm going to snuff that one out. I'm going to remind you that you really are rotten, so that you finally will understand where your righteousness and love comes from. I'll get maybe a little political, because I'm leaving in a couple weeks, so it doesn't matter. But our culture is righteousness on steroids right now. I mean, we are We live in the most, this is going to sound crazy to you, but we live in the most moral time in the history of the world. I mean, everybody is moral. Everybody. It may be different morals than what you like, but everybody's got a moral, and they will tell you about their morality, right? And they will point out where you have not lived up to their cause. And so we boycott things. And we boycott things for what reason? To be seen as righteous. Yeah. And so when we boycott things, we think, theology of glory, this will change the culture one way or the other. Historically, that never happens. In fact, usually the exact opposite happens. And we have these Pyrrhic victories that we think are real victories. Now we have fixed the problem, right? But you've just made everybody just angry, stuff like that. Two things that happen. One is you miss out on enjoying things. So let's say you're a little bit more left-leaning and you don't like Chick-fil-A. So you're going to boycott Chick-fil-A. You're the one missing out on a good chicken sandwich. And you ain't changing anybody's mind. If you like Bud Light, well, there's something wrong with you already. I can't help you. Right? But here's the main point. Okay, so you're going to boycott something for whatever cause, an environmental cause, freedom of religion cause, or whatever. Please tell me what company is going to live up to these standards of yours. Please tell me why you can still have that iPhone then, or those Nike sneakers. Big time in the news, right? Child sacrifice, or child trafficking, human trafficking. The author of the foreword for my first book is somebody who has dedicated his life to this. And he would say, human trafficking is not just this evil people that are just doing evil things. They're fulfilling a market need for cheap labor or cheap sex. You who are so righteous, you're boycotting everything? You like that cheap hotel price? You like that cheap garment? You like that cheap whatever? Where do you think that comes from? Right? Now the point is here not to heap guilt upon you. The point is, if you go by a righteousness by law pathway, you have to boycott everything. You'd have to go off the grid. And then if you did that, you wouldn't be loving your neighbor. Do you see the point? This is the point of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. You can't do it. Right? Watch me do it in your place. Trust me. Do the best you can. Just do what's in front of you, the vocation I gave you. I'm going to figure out the rest, probably not on your timeline, and it's not going to be great, but in the end it'll be fine, and I give you permission to enjoy these things, guilt-free, work hard, say, Lord, have mercy, and then die and go to heaven. That's the message. That's so much more freeing, and I would argue more beneficial to the people around you, instead of you making sure that everybody knows how righteous you are because of your words and your boycotts and all that kind of stuff. Now, I'm not saying that you should follow your conscience. If you don't feel comfortable going to that business, don't go to that business. Just don't think you're righteous because of it. Because if you want to live by the law, then you got to live by the whole law. And ain't nobody standing, right? Does that make sense? All right. Can I go 2 minutes long? I can do it. All right. Job, real quick. Job had everything, and then the devil came to God, and the devil lined up with the angels of God, and I imagine him having this smirk on his face as if to say, God, you ain't nothing, and nobody likes you. And so God says, to the devil, have you considered my servant Job? And the devil scoffs and says, well, of course, Job likes you. He's got all this stuff. If you let me at him, he will curse you and die. And what does God say? Go ahead. Just stop and think about that God didn't just allow, but gave permission to the devil to go after Job. Loses his family, his wealth, and his health. And yet what happens? He does not curse God and die, but rather his faith is stronger. Why? Because Job's got nowhere else to go but to God. So I believe that God and the devil have monthly staff meetings. I can't prove it. But they have a staff meeting on Monday, first Monday of the month. And your names are on the list. And God says, what about my people at St. John's Wauwatosa? And he goes like, well, they have nice cars. Of course they love you. Let me at them and you'll see. And so he goes down the list, and each one he gives parameters, and then he sends the devil into your life. God sends the devil into your life. And that, through the glory glasses, it just doesn't make sense. Just blows your brain. Doesn't make sense. But if you have the cross glasses on, you realize God is using that for your benefit. Now I'm in Romans 8, that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. Good enough? All right, thanks. We'll see you next week, hopefully.